Welcome, everyone. Today we're going deep into Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. This book, it's just incredible, really powerful look at the human spirit, how we find purpose, even when, facing just unimaginable suffering. Excited to dive in and see what we can uncover, what we can learn from Frankl's journey.
Yeah, it's really something how he uses his own experiences, in the Nazi camps to show these universal truths about resilience, finding meaning. Like, he didn't just write about it, he lived it.
Exactly, and he kind of structures the book around these three phases, the psychological phases prisoners went through. The first one being shock. I mean, can you imagine just being ripped from your life? Yeah. Everything taken, your clothes, possessions, even your hair, reduced to a number. It's just, I can't even fathom it.
Yeah, it was a systematic dehumanization, Frankl he describes, arriving at Auschwitz. And a senior prisoner tells him, don't be afraid of the selections, because the SS medical chief, he likes doctors. Terrible advice, turned out to be completely wrong. But it shows you, right, that need for hope, even false hope in that kind of situation.
That really resonates because, we all cling to hope, don't we? Even in chaos.
Yeah.
And Frankl talks about this, surreal element of commerce in the camps, prisoners trading a diamond tie pin for schnapps. It's this stark reminder that even in the darkest times, people still try to, cope, escape, if only for a moment.
Makes you wonder, how do you hold on to your humanity? In a place designed to just strip it away, Frankl was forced to leave his manuscript, his life's work, at the entrance. And the guard just says, shit, as Frankl asked to keep it. Just brutal disregard for everything he valued.
Heartbreaking. But you see his resilience even then. He talks about this skeletal colleague sneaking into their hut, cracking a joke about camp life. That gallows humor, it's a coping mechanism, right? Finding a glimmer of light in the darkness.
The human spirit, right, just fighting to survive. But suicide, that was a constant temptation. Frankl made a pact with himself not to run into the wire, the electric fence. He saw it as giving up, pointless given the already slim odds.
And those odds, they were always on everyone's minds. He tells this chilling story about a transport leaving the camp, probably headed for the gas chambers. And people were just scrambling to get off the list, save themselves or a friend, even if it meant someone else taking their place. Shows you the power of survival instincts.
The pressure was immense, psychological pressure, and it wasn't just physical survival. Frankl noticed how some prisoners, the capos, they kind of adapted by becoming more brutal than even the SS guards. It's a chilling example of how that environment can warp people, even the victims.
It makes you think about the choices we make, right? Under pressure. And in this constant fear, deprivation, how do they cope day to day? Frankl describes this second phase, apathy. Kind of an emotional detachment. Did that make it easier to function?
Seems like a defense mechanism. Frankl, he describes this scene. He's watching a corpse being dragged away, and he's calmly sipping his soup. That emotional numbness, it was widespread, hard to imagine.
It's hard to grasp, but he's showing us how they survived. But did that detachment make it easier to dehumanize others? To do whatever it took, he says, the best of us did not return. Haunting.
It speaks volumes about the moral compromises. But even in that apathy, you see glimmers of humanity, the debates over dividing the bread ration, the little pleasures, like delousing in a warm hut. Those small victories, those bits of control must have been so important.
It's about clinging to normalcy in an environment stripped bare. He even mentions, the near absence of sexual desire. Their minds so preoccupied with just basic survival. Food, warmth, that's what mattered.
Yeah, it shows how much the camp narrowed their focus. The immediate, the tangible, just getting through the day. Anything else requiring mental energy. That was a luxury they couldn't afford.
Which is why I think this idea of finding meaning in a place like that, it's so powerful. And that leads us into Frankl's logotherapy, right? He's not saying you need suffering to find meaning, but that it's possible to find meaning, even surrounded by unimaginable suffering. His own experience proves that.
That's what's fascinating about Frankl. He clung to his manuscript, a page from a prayer book. Small things, but they became anchors for his spirit. Symbols of a world beyond the barbed wire. It's a reminder that meaning, it can be found anywhere if we choose to see it.
And it wasn't just objects. He found solace in nature, in beauty, in the camaraderie of fellow prisoners. He shares this poignant story about a woman finding comfort in a chestnut tree, talking to it, finding connection in its branches. It's so powerful.
That's it. That's Frankl's point. Meaning can be found anywhere if we choose to see it. It's about choosing to focus on what gives you strength, what nourishes you, even when everything else has been taken away.
That inner freedom, that's key. And this leads to the third phase, liberation. and disillusionment. You'd think freedom would be pure joy, but it wasn't that simple.
No, imagine going from absolute control to having to rebuild your whole life. He describes it as a kind of psychological bends, like what diverse experience.
And on top of that, the disillusionment of coming back to a world that had moved on. The pain of lost loved ones. Some even struggled to adapt to having choices again. Must have been overwhelming.
There's this heartbreaking story. A prisoner gets angry at Frankl for not walking through a field of crops. Years of deprivation had, warped his sense of right and wrong. It shows how trauma leaves these scars, even when the physical wounds are healed.
It's a reminder that healing takes time. But Frankl, he doesn't dwell on the negative. He shifts to the lessons learned, the insights, and that's where logotherapy really comes into play.
Logotherapy, it's rooted in this idea that humans were driven by a will to meaning, a need to find purpose. Frankl believed this was our primary drive, contrasting it with Freud's focus on pleasure or Adler's emphasis on power. A real shift in perspective.
So how do we connect this to our own lives, right? Sitting here worlds away from the horrors of a camp, what does Frankl's experience mean for us?
Frankl believed this will to meaning, it's universal, we all have it, and when it's frustrated, when we can't find that purpose, we experience what he called the existential vacuum.
And that vacuum, he argues, it shows up in so many problems we see: boredom, depression, addiction, that feeling of emptiness.
Exactly. Frankl would say, filling that vacuum isn't about pleasure or power, it's about something deeper, connecting to something larger than ourselves.
He identifies 3 ways to find that meaning: creative work, accomplishments, love, human connection, and our attitude toward unavoidable suffering. He gives this example: a prisoner offering his suffering to God to save a loved one. That suffering, in that context, had meaning.
It's about finding purpose, even in the face of what he calls the tragic triad: pain, guilt, and death. Frankl believed these are part of the human condition, not things to avoid, but things we can find meaning in.
So we've talked about the horrors, the phases, the core of logotherapy. But this book, it's not just about surviving. It's about thriving, finding meaning in all aspects of life. He's encouraging us to look for meaning in creativity, connection, even in unavoidable suffering, seeing it as an opportunity for growth.
He's challenging us to ask, what is my unique contribution? What gives my life meaning? Even in adversity, we have the freedom to choose our attitude, how we respond to the challenges life throws at us.
It's incredible how Frankl turns his experience into this guide for all of us. It's like he's saying, look, I went through hell and even there meaning was possible. Incredibly inspiring, but it also makes you wonder, how do we actually apply these ideas, in our everyday lives?
That's the real power of logotherapy, right? It's in the practical application. Frankl gives us these 3 avenues for finding meaning, remember: creative work, love, and our attitude towards suffering. And it's not about seeking out suffering, but how we choose to respond when it inevitably shows up.
So let's break those down a bit. Creative work, that seems, I guess, pretty straightforward. We all have talents, passions, things we enjoy creating.
Yeah.
But how does that tie into meaning?
Frankl, he believed that engaging in those creative pursuits, it allows us to express ourselves, leave our mark. It could be anything, really: writing, painting, building, even starting a business. It's channeling that energy into something that, brings you a sense of accomplishment, like you've contributed something unique.
It's like that feeling of flow, right? When you're completely absorbed in something you love.
Yeah.
And the second avenue, love. That seems so fundamental to the human experience. How did Frankl view love as a source of meaning?
He believed that love is the ultimate way to connect with something greater than ourselves. It's about giving ourselves over to another person, experiencing that deep connection, intimacy. He actually argues that it's through love that we can best glimpse the meaning of life.
It's about stepping outside of ourselves, right? Focusing on something beyond our own needs. And that ties into his 3rd avenue, our attitude towards suffering. This one feels a bit more, challenging to grasp. How can we find meaning in suffering? Isn't it something we generally try to avoid?
It is, and Frankl isn't suggesting we go looking for suffering, but he argues it's an inevitable part of life, and it's through our attitude towards it that we can discover a deeper meaning. He uses the example of a prisoner offering his suffering to God to save a loved one. In that context, that suffering, it held a purpose, a meaning that transcended his own pain.
It's about finding a sense of purpose, even in the midst of hardship. But how do we apply that to our own lives? We may not face, the same level of suffering as someone in a camp, but we all experience pain, loss, disappointment.
Exactly. And Frankl believed that even in those everyday struggles, we can choose our attitude. We can choose to wallow or to find meaning in the experience. Maybe it's about learning a lesson, developing resilience, or finding a new perspective.
It's about reframing the situation,
Right.
right? Looking for the silver lining. And he actually talks about this concept called tragic optimism, the idea that we can find hope and meaning even when facing tragedy.
That's such a powerful concept. It's about acknowledging the pain, the guilt, the death that are just part of being human, but not letting them define us. It's about choosing to see the possibilities for growth, for meaning, even in those darkest times.
It's about choosing to live a life filled with meaning no matter the circumstances. Frankl believed that each of us, we have a unique contribution to make, a unique purpose to fulfill.
He encourages us to ask ourselves, what is my task? What is my mission? It's about identifying our talents, our passions, and using them to make a difference through our work, relationships, creative pursuits. It doesn't matter.
It's about living a life that feels purposeful, aligned with our values. But it's also important to acknowledge that this search for meaning, it's a process. It's not something we achieve overnight. It unfolds over our lifetime.
Absolutely. And Frankl reminds us it's okay to feel lost, uncertain. It's part of the process. He encourages us to embrace the unknown, stay open to new possibilities, trust that meaning will, well, reveal itself in its own time.
It's about staying curious, staying engaged with life, and always seeking that deeper sense of purpose. As we continue this dive into man's search for meaning, what's resonating with you the most so far? What insights are sticking with you?
I think what's hitting me the hardest is Frankl's emphasis on personal responsibility. Despite everything, the horrific circumstances, he believed he had a choice in how he responded. He refused to be a victim. And that's such a powerful lesson. We always have a choice in how we approach life, even when things feel out of our control.
I completely agree. It's a reminder that our mindset, it plays such a huge role in how we experience the world. And for me, what's really resonating is the idea of finding meaning through self-transcendence. It's about focusing on something beyond ourselves, contributing to something bigger. Our work, relationships, creative passions, that's where we find that true fulfillment purpose.
It's about recognizing that we're all interconnected, that our actions, they have ripple effects. And when we choose to live a life of meaning, we not only benefit ourselves, we contribute to the well-being of others.
Frankl's legacy, it reminds us that even in the darkest times, the human spirit can prevail. He encourages us to never give up on that search for meaning, to keep striving for a life that feels, purposeful and fulfilling.
And as we move forward with man's search for meaning, let's keep these insights in mind. Let's explore how we can apply them, how we can cultivate more meaning, more purpose, more joy, even when facing life's challenges.
It's one thing to, talk about these ideas, but I'm curious, how did Frankl actually put this into practice in his own life? After all, he didn't just write about meaning, he lived it.
Oh, absolutely. Frankl's life after the camps, it's a real testament to his philosophy.
He devoted himself to helping others find meaning, working as a psychiatrist, developing logotherapy.
And it wasn't just therapy, right? He found meaning through his writing, lectures, traveling, sharing his message. He truly embodied those principles.
He did, and his work has had such a profound impact on psychology and beyond, really. Logotherapy is still such a valuable tool helping people find meaning no matter their circumstances.
A testament to the power of his message. And as we wrap up this dive into man's search for meaning, I want to leave everyone with a question to think about. What's one small step you can take today to cultivate more meaning in your own life? What act of creation, connection, or maybe even courage can you embrace? Even in the face of, your own tragic triad. Frankl's legacy, it reminds us that the search for meaning, it's a lifelong journey, one that's ultimately up to us to define, but it's a journey worth taking, because it's in that pursuit of meaning that we discover our truest selves and live our most fulfilling lives.
Beautifully said. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey into man's search for meaning. Until next time, keep searching, keep striving, and keep finding meaning in everything you do.